Denver Broncos head coach Sean Payton added valuable depth to the defensive line in the 2025 NFL Draft. Sai'vion Jones will play right away here for this team in 2025. We'll tell you how that's going to be possible on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thanks for tuning in, making us your first listen however you choose to do so. And if you're not yet an everydayer, it's easy to become one. All you got to do is hit that subscribe or that follow button, and you're never going to miss out on what's going on with your favorite team. We bring you a daily Broncos episode every single day, all year long, even throughout the entire offseason. We got you covered here, Broncos Country. As always, I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports.
And I'm Sayre Bedinger, site expert at predominantlyorange.com.
And here's what you can expect on today's episode of the show. Broncos Country, we're continuing our player profile series. We're looking at Sai'vion Jones, the Broncos defensive line addition in the 2025 NFL Draft. We'll tell you where he stands here on the depth chart and why he's going to get some playing time early on this season for Vance Joseph and that defense, but we'll also go through his strengths and his weaknesses, what will keep him on the field, and what are some things that could take him off the field in certain situations. You're going to get all that in today's episode of the show. Sarah, let's talk about Jones here and maybe how he fits on the depth chart right away. I mean, obviously, as the NFL draft was unfolding, you had the Pat Bryant pick, which we previewed and broke down on yesterday's episode show. For anyone who missed it, make sure you go check that one out. But now it's like, all right, hey, what are the Broncos going to do with this other premier capital, which, you know, we knew they were involved in some trading up, moving back a little bit to acquire better premier capital in some of the other later rounds of the draft. Denver ends up trading back into round 3 as we were recording our podcast during the draft here, and they take Sai'vion Jones out of LSU, man. Just a big guy that could play defensive end, man. And there's just so many ways I could see him getting on the field early on here for this Broncos defense.
It's really exciting after you watch the Super Bowl and you saw how the Philadelphia Eagles got after the Kansas City Chiefs and just kind of blew up their offensive line with wave after wave of pass rush. The Denver Broncos, they can do that, right? They led the NFL in sacks last year, and they added a strength to a strength. It was so much fun during the draft. It was already a bonus episode, and then we did an emergency clip within the bonus episode because the pick happened the trade up happened as we were recording or right after we got done with that bonus. So it was fun. But I love this pick. And I think kind of just based on where the pick was placed and the fact that it was kind of last minute on day 2, it's almost the most underrated pick the Broncos made in the 2025 NFL draft, isn't it? It's like we talk a lot about RJ Harvey and a lot about Pat Bryant, and then we talk about the punter. You know, you talk about the basketball playing tight end, and this guy kind of flies under the radar, doesn't he? I mean, even as you and I were prepping our kind of just this series that we're going to talk through every player, you reminded me after I was like, yeah, Pat Bryant, then we'll have Q Robinson. And you're like, yeah, Sai'vion Jones too is in there. And it's like, oh yeah, that's right. The Broncos have this guy. He's good, Cody. He's really good. I enjoyed watching him play over these last, week plus, just kind of seeing the tenacity with which he plays. And when you look at the Broncos defensive line, isn't that just a theme with everybody that plays out there? Like, these guys are all hair on fire. You don't want to have to block this guy one-on-one types of players, whether it's Zach Allen, John Franklin Myers, DJ Jones. These guys give offensive linemen such fits, and to have that as a contagious quality amongst your D line, it's so much fun to see. And these guys I think this guy's going to fit in perfectly with everybody else in that group.
I wonder when we heard from George and Sean in the pre-draft press conference, remember they talked about the depth of this year's NFL draft class, specifically running back and defensive line. And they said, we have a guy that we feel like can be ready to go day one. I wonder if they were talking about him considering the fact that they traded up back into the end of day number 2 to be able to get him. I'm very curious about that because right now, I mean, Sarah, going into the NFL draft, the Broncos defensive line in terms of starters is set, right? You got Zach Allen at the end, John Franklin Myers at the other DN spot here, DJ Jones, you got Malcolm Roach behind them, and then you got Jordan Jackson, who rotated in quite a bit last season, was an impact player. The Broncos and George Payton have acknowledged publicly that they are very high on. So now you add in another guy, and Sarah, you and I kind of touched on this a little bit. how does this impact the Broncos with contract negotiations with Zach Allen? It doesn't. John Franklin Myers, however, I think this probably could impact the most here. But let's take a look here at the depth chart and where Jones fits in and why he's going to play here right away. There, I already mentioned the starters there. The other defensive end on this roster right now is Matt Henningsen. You know, you factor in other guys at D-line on this roster that we haven't talked about. Inyoma Uwazurike, who's 6'6", 320 pounds. I think Inyoma's roster status going into the season is largely in question. But I think the Broncos are looking for a fourth guy, essentially, right? Because you factor in, when I talk about 4 players at D end, I'm talking about Zach Allen, I'm talking about JFM. Those are 2. Jordan Jackson, that third guy. Sai'vion Jones is that fourth guy. I mean, he has all those traits where he's going to plug into this defense, which is coached by Jamar Cain, who coached him back at LSU. There's the ties that bind there. There's a reason they went out and they got this guy. But, man, you watch him on tape, he's got such a high motor for a guy his size. And I really think this was the Broncos saying, hey, in case we can't bring back a guy like JFM after we extend Nick Bonito, Cortland Sutton, and Zach Allen, we need to have a backup plan in place. I feel like Sai'vion Jones is a backup plan as an insurance policy there, but he wasn't drafted just to be a backup plan. I think he's got potential here in 2-3 years to be a starter here on this defense.
And you need guys that have that positional versatility, right? When the ticker came across the screen, the Broncos drafted Sai'vion Jones, the initial thing on NFL Network said edge out of LSU. And so you and I were like, wait a second, an edge guy? What the heck are we talking about here? Then you look up his measurables and things like that. I mean, this guy is big, Cody. I mean, 6'5" and change. So with cleats on, he's going to be 6'6", 280 pounds, 33.5-inch arms, 80+ inch wingspan. You can float this guy all over the defensive line. And as teams are living in their nickel formation, or as, you know, that 4-2-5 sort of becomes the mainstay as far as what defenses are doing in today's NFL, this is the type of player that you can put on. You could put him at defensive end. You could put him outside the shoulder of the tackle, or you could put him outside the outside shoulder of a guard. I mean, you could line him up inside and say, yeah, let's go 3-tech. And let's put him off the nose and say, hey, go just cause havoc out there. I mean, you're going up against a way shorter armed lineman at that point if you're playing against a center. So go use your length to your advantage. Go bowl this guy over and free up, you know, Zach Allen and JFM on the other side of you. It's going to be fascinating to see how he gets utilized. But as the NFL trends toward that positionless sort of style of defense, you can't help but wonder the vision for this guy early on has got to be, especially if he is, like you said, the player that George Paton and Sean Payton were saying, hey, we feel like there's a guy on day 2, day 3 who could play right away. If this is that guy, you got to think that his versatility is going to come into play.
It has to be him. I mean, just based on what George and Sean said. And I mean, I'm trying to figure out what other guys are, because we know this was a very deep defensive line class in this year's NFL draft. But you look at obviously his time at LSU. Really, this past season is when he turned and just flipped on another switch, became just a different player than what he was in his first other years combined. I mean, 43 pressures on the season this past year, Sayre, for a guy of his size. I think when you look at how the Broncos defense, how it attacks and how it tries to generate pressure, the different stunts that Vance Joseph and Jamar Cain like to run and coordinate there in certain situations, I mean, it kind of seems like a great match here for a guy like Sai'vion Jones. And look, I'm excited to see if there's going to be an impact as well. I couldn't find a statistic on maybe like passes batted down at the line of scrimmage, but because he's got that 6'5" height, I think that's going to play a factor into him getting his hands up at the line of scrimmage. That's going to make it harder for quarterbacks in their passing windows. There's a certain DNA that the Broncos are bringing in on that defensive line with the guys that they have and the guys that we have seen emerge. Sai'vion seems like a seamless fit, and I think that's exactly why. So it's like, what is our expectation here? Well, I think right now, Sayre, he is going to be that fourth guy right next to Jordan Jackson, where they're going to rotate in when Zach Allen, which I imagine if Denver finds a way to extend him, part of me is wondering is like, we know how hard you work. We know that you will never want to come off the field, but there's times where you need a break. You need a breather for even just a couple of snaps there. We know we could put a guy like Jordan Jackson, Sai'vion Jones in and know that, hey, you're going to get that same level of effort. that to me, I think is going to be a selling point here to keep Zach Allen fresh, to protect the Broncos investment if they extend him. But then you get these younger guys some looks as well. I mean, Sayre, you have to win in today's game. You can't just have your normal 11 guys on defense. It's the guys when you rotate in your different personnel packages. Can you win with those guys as well? We talk so much about the 12th man. Well, ideally, these guys rotating in are really trying to establish that. And I think he's in a perfect position to be a 12th man here for the Denver Broncos defense this upcoming season. We'll see. Obviously, rookie minicamp coming up this week. We can get our first glance at the Broncos rookie. But Broncos country, we're not done yet. We got a lot to break down on today's episode of the show. One thing we're going to get into are the strengths here of Sai'vion Jones, not to mention the power that he possesses. How can the Broncos use that to their advantage? We'll dive deeper to that and much more here on today's episode. Locked On Broncos.
Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA playoffs, they're into the second round already, and every single night is going to deliver highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there has never been a better time to get in on the action.
Well, I mean, not to mention, if you're a Denver fan, you got SGA versus Jokic. That should define the MVP narrative here in round number 2. But FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live as the games are ongoing with player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays. Fans have way more ways than ever to play smart and win big.
So which players are going to show up in these big moments here? Because obviously in big series, we're going to have players stepping up, whether they're bench guys, whether they're starters. You can go on FanDuel and check out all the different prop bets, even mid-game as the action is unfolding. And if you've got to read up with who's heating up, like, why not back it up with a same game parlay, right? And $200 in bonus bets, that adds to the excitement, Cody, if your first $5 bet will hit.
Well, if you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA.
Sai'vion Jones brings a lot to the table for the Denver Broncos defensive line, but my favorite aspect of his game is the fact that when the ball is snapped, this guy is an absolute bat out of hell. Cody and I are going to tell you what that means and why that can get him on the field right away for this Denver Broncos stellar defensive line, one of the highest graded position groups on the team, according to Sean Payton and George Payton. But Broncos country, before we get into the positives of this guy's game and what he brings to your Denver Broncos, I want to say thank you to all of you for making us your first listen of the day every single day. If you haven't already subscribed to Locked On Broncos, do that right now. Take a couple of seconds wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube or both. If you haven't done both already, hit subscribe and make us part of your day, because you know your boys got you covered. Everything that happens with your favorite team. And Cody, today nothing has happened. We're just analyzing one of, I think, the most underrated picks of the Denver Broncos 2025 NFL draft class, Sai'vion Jones. We talked about where he could potentially fit on the depth chart. You and I both kind of agree, right next to Jordan Jackson, could probably push for Jordan Jackson's snaps that he had last year, in fact, in my opinion. So I think that what we need to talk about now is, like, what are the strengths of his game? What caused the Broncos to trade up for this guy? Because they moved up a considerable amount, I think 10, 11 spots, something like that, to go ahead and get him. And so they felt strongly about him, and he brings a lot to the table. There's no doubt about that.
I mean, we talk about the size that he has. I think that's obviously very impressive. You know, he's not necessarily built like a defensive end that's got some speed rush to him. He's more of a power guy, which I like that. I think the Broncos need a good combination of that, because I look at JFM. JFM is dominant in terms of power, but JFM can also move pretty well. Zach Allen, we know, is an elusive guy, high motor. The thing I like about Sai'vion Jones is that he has a very, very similar high motor. I mean, I watched this guy against Alabama, and look, LSU got the brakes beaten off of them by Jalen Milroe in Alabama this past season. But one guy that stood out to me defensively on tape was Sai'vion Jones. He had to figure out how to stop Jalen Milroe and his dual threat, athletic ability. And the one thing I liked is that on the Alabama tape, he showcased, the ability of kind of not playing a spy, but he was eyeing the quarterback, especially when they would run some read option looks. Like, he would squeeze down the end of the line of scrimmage. We call it hill line depth, where he's just he's punching with his outside hand against the tackle. If there's a down block, he's squeezing. He's not getting too far upfield, but he's squeezing down the line of scrimmage. And that way, if the quarterback hands the ball off, he can squeeze it down and wrap it up like he's playing the dive. If he hands it off, like if he doesn't hand it off and gets to the outside, he can at least chase at an angle where he knows he's got outside help, right? And that, if that guy forces him back in, he's going to go right back into him. I'd say he's a smart football player, high football IQ. You can definitely see that on tape. He makes up for a lot of things that he doesn't have in speed with, I think, strength and power. And I think that's one reason why the Broncos decided to go and get him. They're adding a little bit more power to their defensive line unit. And I agree with you. I think he is one of those guys that could push Jordan Jackson as that first guy rotating in a defensive end. I think that's going to be a competition to watch here during training camp.
Well, we talked about the size in the first segment, obviously 6'5" and change, 280 pounds, 33.5-inch arms. He scored in the 95th percentile in the 10-yard split. So he's got some explosiveness off his get off. 9'11" broad jump was in the 80th percentile. So the athletic traits are there, a 9.20 on the RAS scale overall, which is really good. It might have been the highest of the draft class, I think, or other than Jahdae Barron potentially. But regardless of his athletic traits, Cody, what you see or what I see when I turn this guy's game, highlights and tape on and things like that is I describe it as the bat out of hell. What does that mean? Well, there's just kind of a diabolical intent when the ball is snapped, and there's sort of a measured form of chaos with his length, his explosiveness, his effort, his tenacity. Like you mentioned, those secondary rush moves. If he gets caught up in the first, in his first pass rush move, he's going to absolutely do whatever it takes. And just it's like this flailing that happens. There's guys that I would, kind of compare it to. I'm not saying he is Chris Jones, but like when you watch Chris Jones play, the guy has such long arms and he's coming against guys who are so much smaller and shorter armed than he is that it almost just looks like a fracas of activity out there. And so that bat out of hell mentality is like, hey, I'm here to cause chaos. If I got to get my hand up in a throwing lane, that's what I'm going to do. If I got to use a secondary rush, that's what I'm going to do. It may not always look the prettiest, but my effort is going to get me there. And there's a section of our zoo here in Omaha, Cody, where there's just bats that are just sitting out. And I'm not going to lie, I'm terrified of these bats. They're just sitting there, and there's a sign that says like, hey, just so you know, these bats, they have the freedom to fly around after a certain time every single day. And so you're walking around, you're just kind of waiting for the bats to start flapping their wings. That's kind of what this guy is going to bring to the table, in my opinion. Offensive linemen aren't always going to know how to deal with him because you can't just absorb him and he'll be out of the play. He's going to find a secondary way and a third way and a fourth way to get to the quarterback.
A guy who can impact the A and the B gaps, but also be able to play the outside, C gap or the E alley a little bit. I think that's one thing we always talk about is, can you do a little bit of everything? Like, I think when you look at this Broncos defense, we talk so much about positional versatility. Not saying that Sai'vion Jones is going to line up as a 0 technique, which is head up on the center, or a 1 technique, which is either shoulder of a center. But I think he can do that. He certainly can, but he can play a 3 technique where he's on the outside shoulder of an offensive guard. He can play inside shoulder of the offensive tackle, which we call that a 4-eye technique, or he could play outside, just to be able to crash it in. It just depends on what the Broncos have personnel wise. But the thing I like here about Jones as well is, you talk about that motor, but for a guy of his size to be able to play in the trenches the way that he has, here's the stat that stood out here from 2024, and obviously his season at LSU. He finished the season with 8 total tackles for a loss behind the line of scrimmage, right? And look, that's an important metric in today's game, right? I think Malcolm Roach last year, when the Broncos signed him in free agency, had one of the best overall win rates in terms of TFLs before he became a Denver Bronco. And we were like, hey, why are the Broncos going out there and getting this guy? Well, it made a lot of sense then. And obviously you saw it on the tape. Now the Broncos, they really believe in winning at the line of scrimmage, whether that's by a stunt or whether that's by, hey, we want you to draw a double team and we want everybody else to win a one-on-one. That's the identity of this attacking style of defense that Vance Joseph loves to play. So I like that. And I also found the stat on getting your hands up at the line of scrimmage. Sayre, he had 2 passes defense at the line of scrimmage last year. So not the number that was necessarily that stood out here, but he did have 2 forced fumbles on the year, 1 fumble recovery, as well. And he had one game last season to start the year where he had 2 sacks. That was against USC when LSU lost that game 27-20. But man, I think you talk about bright spots. When you think about LSU, a lot of people are looking at linebacker. They obviously had a very talented linebacker this past year. You look at the secondary because a lot of people say, hey, that's like a DBU place, LSU. I looked at LSU's defense and I was like, man, Sai'vion Jones is a guy who stands out. Now I'm curious to see what number he's going to wear at the NFL level. We'll certainly see that because if I'm not mistaken, I think he wore number 35, which it's a little weird for a defensive end to be able to wear that. But we'll see what the case is here. We'll see what numbers the Broncos have available here. But Broncos Country, we've highlighted some of the strengths here about Jones and his game and what he's going to bring to the table for the Broncos defense. But what are some areas he can improve on the most? We'll tell you why maybe being able to drive his feet a little bit more might help him in securing some tackles instead of missing some. We'll dive deeper to that much more here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by our friends over there at Skylight Calendar. Say goodbye to sticky notes, scribbled plans on the fridge, and overlapping calendar invites in your phone. The Skylight Calendar is here to bring clarity to the chaos and help families stay organized without the stress. This sleek digital display syncs with your existing calendars, whether it's Google, Apple, Outlook, and more, making it simple to track appointments, practices, dinners, and reminders all in one easy-to-see place.
I don't know if there's a more ideal question to answer than this. What would it mean to eliminate the I didn't know excuse from your family's routine, right? Like, what if you could just assign everyone in your family their own color, and that solves all the confusion about who does what around your house? Cody, I have 3 kids that are being homeschooled right now and a baby, and my wife and I both work from home. We both do a ton of different stuff. So eliminating that I didn't know that was my responsibility excuse, that is going to help tremendously. So this is a huge, huge life hack for anybody that works from home, anybody that maybe struggles like me with kind of scheduling things out and time blocking, time management, things like that. This is going to help you stay on track every single day.
My fiance and I, we have our wedding coming up, then we have our honeymoon. So we have a lot of deadlines still to come before our wedding actually happens. And so the Skylight Calendar, I've got one hanging up inside my kitchen. It's great for both my fiance and I, and helps us understand when things are due. So that's going to be a fun thing that we're going to use here. I love it. I know you'll love it as well, especially with Mother's Day coming up. Right now, Skylight is offering our listeners $30 off their 15-inch calendars by going to skylightcal.com/NFL. Go to skylightcal.com/NFL for $30 off your 15-inch calendar. That's skylightcal.com/NFL. Get yours today. The fourth quarter action of today's episode, Locked On Broncos, is here as we're breaking down Sai'vion Jones and his fit here on the Broncos defense following the 2025 NFL Draft. Rookie minicamp is this week, Broncos Country, so stay tuned. We'll be there covering practice. You'll get recap here, bonus episodes here, Locked On Broncos throughout the weekend when that event takes place at Broncos Park, powered by Common Spirit. But Sayre, let's go through some of the perceived weaknesses here of Sai'vion Jones. Now, obviously, there is no perfect candidate. There's no perfect prospect out there. There might be one or two that maybe we have seen over time. I'd be very curious to see who people think in the comments who was a perfect draft prospect from top to bottom in the scouting process. Not in this year's draft, but maybe in any NFL draft that has led to player success. But Sai'vion Jones, we highlighted the strengths like his power, his size, his high motor, his football IQ. But there are some things I think when you look at the tape here of Sai'vion Jones that certainly stand out as areas that he can improve and get better on. I'll say the first thing, the one thing I noticed in that Alabama game specifically, he's doing a great job squeezing it down the line of scrimmage, but there's times where he'll go to make a tackle on a guy in the A gap or the B gap. Sometimes he shoots his upper body, and so he leaves his feet a little bit, which means that, you know, he may not have all the momentum because, hey, he's a big guy. It means he's going to land hard. Sometimes guys run through some of his tackles if he leaves his feet. So I would say he could work on squeezing it down tighter, wrapping up and securing, and then driving his feet a little bit more. This is just my critique from what I've seen, but what are some of the other weaknesses that maybe have been notable here about Jones that he can improve on at the NFL level?
Well, I think anytime you're dealing with a guy whose biggest strength is his aggressiveness and tenacity and hustle and, you know, being a tryhard out there, that can also be your own worst enemy at times, right? When your aggressiveness works against you. And then, you know, teams and quarterbacks start realizing like, hey, if I just wait for this guy to get in my periphery, all I got to do is step up because he's going to over pursue every single time. Or all I got to do is stop on a dime here and cut the other way, and this guy's going to over pursue. That's where I think you got to start working smarter, not harder, right? I mean, there's a time and a place to be the try hard, but there's also a time and a place where you've got to be that one who, hey, I'm going to be the best. I think Jonathan Cooper figured this out, Cody, because early on in his NFL career, that was what kind of defined him was, man, this guy has got some serious effort and hustle to him, but he couldn't stay on the field consistently because there was a little too much of the over pursuit, a little too much trying hard. I think that's where Sai'vion Jones can get himself into trouble there too, is just being a little over aggressive at times, overrunning plays, getting too deep of an arc, on his pass rush, things like that. And so it's one of those types of things where you're like, yeah, my weakness is I care too much. It's that's what it kind of sounds like, right? But I think that it really is the top area of his game that he can clean up is like, don't always work harder, work a little smarter at times.
One, I think maybe and this is I don't feel like a great weakness for someone to pinpoint, but somebody, mentioned he's not a speed rusher. I don't think that's his game, is to be a speed rusher. I think he's got a fast first step and a high motor. Really, that's all you need. But for him to be a speed rusher, I mean, if we're talking about that, then ideally we would be thinking about edge rusher, outside linebacker. He's a defensive end. He's going to play inside. He doesn't need to be a speed rusher. So I think some of the critiques of that, I think, are a little unfounded because that's not the role or the vision I think that the team certainly has for him. I mean, but you nailed it there. Like, we talk about controlled chaos, right? Or contained chaos within your role. You don't want to over pursue to a point where maybe you cut in front of somebody else and you do like trying to do their job. We always did that. And when I was coaching, one thing we always touched on with our defensive ends is you have a certain job, right? If you are keeping contained, you cannot let anybody get outside of you. If you're going to rush inside, then you have to stay on your pass rush trajectory and you can't pivot it, because then you might get in front of another rusher. Then it creates an opening for a back or a quarterback to keep it and go. I don't see really these being an issue with Sai'vion Jones. He doesn't have that on his tape, but I think the ideal thing is for him to get experience here, special teams wise. Is that going to be an area where he's going to play here early on? I don't think it'll be on punt return. I don't think it'll be on punt, but PAT, like point after try. On the offensive side, maybe you bring in a guy like that. Block, PAT block. Certainly that's going to be an area here, because who carved out a little bit of a name for himself in the NFL, who was on the Denver Broncos before he became a starter at defensive end for Denver. Trivia question here, Sayre. And when we see a Broncos Country picks it up before we give the answer away, had a special teams impact before he became a defensive end starter, got his hand up at the line of scrimmage and ended up blocking a kick. This is in recent memory, in the last 6 to 7 years. Do you know who that player is off the top of your head?
I'm trying to think of guys who blocked a lot of kicks. I think of Shelby Harris immediately.
Bing, 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 bing. There you go. Nailed it.
Hey, I love it. I'm with it. I'm for it. If this guy becomes that type of impact player, that's kind of almost exactly the archetype that you're trying to teach these guys to be nowadays, is like, do everything that you can with the snaps that you're being given, whether it's on, field goal block, or whether it's, hey, if you get out there for kickoff coverage, because you're going to need bigger athletic guys out there now to make tackles, to make plays. That's what you got to do. You got to maximize every single opportunity. Shelby Harris kind of defined that, whether it was getting his hand up in front of a field goal, or whether it was getting his hand up in the throwing lane, and then eventually, really refining his craft as a pass rusher, stopping the run. That's one thing that Sai'vion Jones did really well last year at LSU. I think he was 9th best in the country in terms of run stuffs, according to PFF. So really, really good stuff from him. It's just going to be about maximizing now those snaps, because you're not going to be playing 700 plus this coming season.
Yeah, and that'll be nice. I think that'll benefit him. Like, you don't want to have to play that many snaps. I mean, obviously the college game, there are a lot of teams that run no huddle. So there's going to be times where you're going to be planting, making a tackle and getting up and going. That wears on you if you're a big guy, But I wanted to ask you this as well. We have seen this, and I think with the Broncos specifically, like when they had really good teams with Peyton Manning and they had solidified starters on the defensive line over time, who have we seen emerge at various positions defensively? We just mentioned Shelby Harris, but guys who were special teams players first before they became starters and impact players. Wesley Woodyard is another name that comes to mind here. David Bruton, Kayvon Webster, though I wouldn't say he necessarily was a key. He wasn't a starter. He had to start a few games due to injury, but man, he was such a pivotal role player who really carved out his niche there on special teams. Justin Simmons played special teams a little bit before he became the safety of the Broncos that we all know and love, obviously, to this day. So I think for these guys in this year's NFL draft, and especially the guy we're going to be talking about on tomorrow's episode of the show, I think it's important that you get out and you carve a role for yourself, whether it be a rotational role defensively right away, but special teams has to be a factor when you're talking about a 53-man roster and you're really trying to make the best decision from a roster construction point. If you're George Paton, Sean Payton, as what do we need to assemble a team that's going to be not only competitive offensively, defensively, but also on special teams? How can they make a unit that was good even better? They had some holes and some things they actually had to put some blemish on there a little bit, but Darren Rizzi's going to come in and he's going to transform the special teams side, and I'm very excited to see how it's all going to play out here. But Broncos Country, that'll wrap up today's profile series review here on Sai'vion Jones, defensive end out of LSU. He's going to play D-end here for the Broncos. Let us know your thoughts on him, your perceived strengths and weaknesses from things that you've seen of him, what you would like to see from him going into training camp. And on top of that, tomorrow's episode for all you everydayers out there, we're going to take a look next at Q Robinson. While the pass rush department might look a little steep for him in terms of getting on the field for defensive playing time, special teams might be the way that he gets on the field and has an impact for this Broncos team in 2025. We'll break him down and much more on tomorrow's episode of the show.